讀你聽2.0，今日我哋繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 我哋讀到 Part 2嘅第21節，呢節嘅名叫做 In which Camacho's wedding is continued with other delightful incidents。 顧名思義啦，盛大嘅婚宴呢係繼續進行中嘅。上一次發生咩事呢？ Don Quixote 同 Sancho 本來就喺婚宴之外同立歇息嘅，當佢哋聞到傳來陣陣香味啊，都係決定嚟湊下熱鬧。好多嘢食，好多嘢玩，氣氛非常之好。咁 Sancho 咧就企喺 Camacho 呢個有錢人嗰邊，佢認為咧 Camacho 佢有錢，而佢攞出嚟同我哋分享，大家都有得益，有咩唔好啊？咁但係Don Quixote咧就覺得 Sancho 因為物質所迷惑啦。好，我哋睇下呢一節嘅故事先。
While Don Quixote and Sancho were engaged in the discussion set forth the last chapter, they heard loud shouts and a great noise, which were uttered and made by the men on the mares as they went at full gallop, shouting, to receive the bride and bridegroom, who were approaching with musical instruments and pageantry of all sorts around them, and accompanied by the priest and the relatives of both, and all the most distinguished people of the surrounding villages. When Sancho saw the bride, he exclaimed, "By my faith, she is not dressed like a country girl, but like some fine court lady. Egad, as well as I can make out, the patena she wears rich coral, and her green cuenza stuff is 30-pound velvet, and then the white linen trimming, by my oath, but it's satin. Look at her hands, jet rings on them. May I never have luck if they're not gold rings, and real gold, and set with pearls as white as curdled milk, and every one of them worth an eye of one's head. Wholesome baggage. What hair she has! If it's not a wig, I never saw longer or fairer all the days of my life. See how bravely she bears herself, and her shape. Wouldn't you say she was like a walking palm tree loaded with clusters of dates? For the trinkets she has hanging from her hair and neck look just like them. I swear in my heart she is a brave lass, and fit to pass over the banks of Flanders." Don Quixote laughed at Sancho's boorish eulogies and thought that, saving his lady Dulcinea El Toboso, he had never seen a more beautiful woman. The fair Quiteria appeared somewhat pale, which was, no doubt, because of the bad night brides always past dressing themselves out for their wedding on the morrow. They advanced towards the theatre that stood on one side of the meadow, decked with carpets and bows, where they were to plight their troth, and from which they were to behold the dances and plays. But at the moment of their arrival at the spot they heard a loud outcry behind them, and a voice exclaiming, "Wait a little, ye, as inconsiderate as ye are hasty." At these words all turned round, and perceived that the speaker was a man clad in what seemed to be a loose black coat garnished with crimson patches like flames. He was crowned with a crown of gloomy cypress, and in his hand he held a long staff. As he approached, he was recognized by everyone as the gay Basilio, and all waited anxiously to see what would come of his words, in dread of some catastrophe in consequence of his appearance at such a moment. He came up at last weary and breathless, and planting himself in front of the bridal pair, drove his staff, which had a peeled spike at the end, into the ground, and, with a pale face and eyes fixed on Quiteria, he thus addressed her in a hoarse, trembling voice. "Well dost thou know, ungrateful Quiteria, that according to the holy law we acknowledge, so long as live thou canst take no husband. Nor art thou ignorant either that, in my hopes that time and my own exertions would improve my fortunes, I have never failed to observe the respect due to thy honour. But thou, casting behind thee all thou owest to my true love, would surrender what is mine to another whose wealth serves to bring him not only good fortune but supreme happiness. And now to complete it, I will, with my own hands, do away with the obstacle that may interfere with it, and remove myself from between you. Long live the rich Camacho. Many a happy year may he live with the ungrateful Quiteria, and let the poor Basilio die. Basilio, whose poverty clipped the wings of his happiness, and brought him to the grave." And so saying, he seized the staff he had driven into the ground, and leaving one half of it fixed there, showed it to be a sheath that concealed a tolerably long rapier, and what may be called its hilt being planted in the ground. He swiftly, coolly, and deliberately threw himself upon it, and in an instant the bloody point and half the steel blade appeared at his back. The unhappy man, falling to the earth, bathed in his blood, and transfixed by his own weapon. His friends at once ran to his aid, filled with grief at his misery and sad fate. And Don Quixote, dismounting from Rocinante, hastened to support him, and took him in his arms, and found he had not yet ceased to breathe. They were about to draw out the rapier, but the priest who was standing by objected to its being withdrawn before he had confessed him, as the instant of his withdrawal would be that of his death. Basilio, however, reviving slightly, said in a weak voice, as though in pain, "If thou wouldst consent, cruel Quiteria, to give me thy hand as my bride in this last fatal moment, I might still hope that my rashness would find pardon, as by its means I attained the bliss of being thine." Hearing this, the priest bade him think of the welfare of his soul rather than of the cravings of the body, and in all earnestness implore God's pardon for his sins and for his rash resolve. To which Basilio replied that he was determined not to confess unless Quiteria first gave him her hand in marriage, for that happiness would compose his mind and give him courage to make his confession. Don Quixote, hearing the wounded man's entreaty, exclaimed aloud that what Basilio asked was just and reasonable, and moreover a request that might be easily complied with, and that it would be as much to Signor Camacho's honor to receive the lady's Quiteria as the widow of the brave Basilio as if he received her direct from her father. In this case, said he, it will be only to say yes, and no consequences can follow the utterance of the word, for the nuptial couch of this marriage must be the grave. Camacho was listening to all this, perplexed and bewildered and not knowing what to say or do, but so urgent were the entreaties of Basilio's friends, imploring him to allow Quiteria to give him her hand, so that his soul, quitting this life in despair, should not be lost, that they moved, nay, forced him to say that if Quiteria were willing to give it, he was satisfied, as it was only putting off the fulfillment of his wishes for a moment. At once all assailed Quiteria and pressed her, some with prayers, and others with tears, and others with persuasive arguments, to give her hand to poor Basilio. But she, harder than marble and more unmoved than any statue, seemed unable or unwilling to utter a word, nor would she have given any reply had not the priest bade her decide quickly what she meant to do, as Basilio now had his soul at his teeth, and there was no time for hesitation. On this the fair Quiteria, to all appearance distressed, grieved, and repentant, advanced without a word to where Basilio lay, his eyes already turned in his head, his breathing short and painful, murmuring the name of Quiteria between his teeth, and apparently about to die like a heathen and not like a Christian. Quiteria approached him, and kneeling, demanded his hand by signs without speaking. Basilio opened his eyes, and gazing fixedly at her, said, "O Quiteria, why hast thou turned compassionate in a moment when thy compassion will serve as a dagger to rob me of life? For I have not now the strength left either to bear the happiness thou givest me in accepting me as thine, or to suppress the pain that is rapidly drawing the dead shadow of death over my eyes. What I entreat of thee, O thou fatal star to me, is that the hand thou demandest of me and wouldst give me be not given out of complacence or to deceive me afresh, but that thou confess and declare that without any constraint upon thy will thou givest it to me as to thy lawful husband. For it is not meet that thou shouldst trifle with me at such a moment as this, or have recourse to falsehoods with one who has dealt so truly by thee." While uttering these words, he showed such weakness that the bystanders expected each return of faintness would take his life with it. Then Quiteria, overcome with modesty and shame, holding in her right hand the hand of Basilio, said, "No force would bend my will, as freely, therefore, as it is possible for me to do so. I give thee the hand of a lawful wife, and take thine if thou givest it to me of thine own free will, untroubled and unaffected by the calamity thy hasty act has brought upon thee." "Yes, I give it," said Basilio, not agitated or distracted, but with unclouded reason that heaven is pleased to grant me. "Thus do I give myself to be thy husband." "And I give myself to be thy wife," said Quiteria, "whether thou livest many years, or they carry thee from my arms to the grave." "For one so badly wounded," observed Sancho at this point, "this young man has a great deal to say. They should make him leave off billing and cooing, and attend to his soul, for to my thinking he has it more on his tongue than on his teeth." Basilio and Quiteria having thus joined hands, the priest, deeply moved with tears in his eyes, pronounced a blessing upon them, and implored heaven to grant an easy passage to the soul of the newly wedded man, who, the instant he received the blessing, started nimbly to his feet, and with unparalleled effrontery pulled up the rapier that had been sheathed in his body. All the bystanders were astounded, and some, more simple than inquiring, began shouting, "A miracle! A miracle!" But Basilio replied, "No miracle, no miracle, only a trick, a trick." The priest, perplexed and amazed, made haste to examine the wound with both hands, and found that the blade had passed, not through Basilio's flesh and ribs, but through a hollow iron tube full of blood, which he had adroitly fixed at the place, the blood, as was afterwards ascertained, having been so prepared as not to congeal. In short, the priest and Camacho and most of those present saw they were tricked and made fools of. The bride showed no signs of displeasure at the deception. On the contrary, hearing them say that the marriage, being fraudulent, would not be valid, she said that she confirmed it afresh, whence they all concluded that the affair had been planned by agreement and understanding between the pair, whereat Camacho and his supporters were so mortified that they proceeded to revenge themselves by violence, and a great number of them drawing their swords attacked Basilio, in whose protection as many more swords were an instant unsheathed, while Don Quixote, taking the lead on the horseback, with his lance over his arm and well covered with his shield, made all give way before him. Sancho, who never found any pleasure or enjoyment in such doings, retreated to the wine jars from which he had taken his delectable skimmings, considering that, as a holy place, that spot would be respected. "Hold, sirs, hold!" cried Don Quixote in a loud voice. "We have no right to take vengeance for wrongs that love may do to us. Remember, love and war are the same thing, and as in war it is allowable and common to make use of wiles and stratagems to overcome the enemy, so in the contests and rivalries of love the tricks and devices employed to attain the desired end are justifiable, provided they be not to the discredit or dishonor of the loved object. Quiteria belonged to Basilio, and Basilio to Quiteria by the just and beneficent disposal of heaven. Camacho is rich, and can purchase his pleasure when, where, and as it pleases him. Basilio has but this ewe lamp, and no one, however powerful he may be, shall take her from him. These two whom God hath joined man cannot separate, and he who attempts it must first pass the point of his lance. And so saying, he brandished it so stoutly and dexterously that he overawed all who did not know him. But so deep an impression had the rejection of Quiteria made on Camacho's mind that it banished her at once from his thoughts, and so the counsels of the priest, who was a wise and kindly disposed man, prevailed with him, and by their means he and his partisans were pacified and tranquilized, and to prove it put up their swords again, inveighing against the pliancy of Quiteria rather than the craftiness of Basilio. Camacho maintaining that if Quiteria as a maiden had such a love for Basilio, she would have loved him too as a married woman, and that he ought to thank heaven more for having taken her than for having given her. Camacho and those of his following, therefore, being consoled and pacified, those on Basilio's side were appeased, and the rich Camacho, to show that he felt no resentment for the trick and did not care about it, desired the festival to go on just as if he were married in reality. Neither Basilio, however, nor his bride, nor their followers would take any part in it, and they withdrew to Basilio's village. For the poor, if they are persons of virtue and good sense, have those who follow, honor, and uphold them, just as the rich have those who flatter and dance attendance on them. With them they carried Don Quixote, regarding him as a man of worth and a stout one. Sancho alone had a cloud on his soul, for he found himself debarred from waiting for Camacho's splendid feast and festival, which lasted until night, and thus dragged away, he moodily followed his master, who accompanied Basilio's party, and left behind him the flesh pots of Egypt, though in his heart he took them with him, and their now nearly finished skimmings that he carried in the bucket conjured up visions before his eyes of the glory and abundance of the good cheer he was losing. And so, vexed and dejected, though not hungry, without dismounting from Dapple, he followed the footsteps of Rocinante.
好，呢一節咧就有好多動作啊 ，Basilio 闖入呢個婚禮，以死相脅，將一把劍咧插咗喺地下，然之後接就跳落去，咁啊穿透咗自己嘅身體，非常之震撼嘅畫面啦，大量嘅血液流出。佢臨死之前呢，就要求 Quiteria 嫁俾佢，就向住神、向住現場嘅神父啦發誓，仲要講明係唔係因為佢嘅以死相搏，係因為佢真心想嫁俾佢，佢咧就死得瞑目。 Camacho 都唔知點樣反應喎，佢就係知道咧現場都有多同情之聲，同埋就係當 Basilio 死咗之後，轉眼即逝，咁 Quiteria 咧作為 Basilio 嘅寡婦嫁俾佢咧，就猶如佢喺 Quiteria 嘅父親接手一樣咁嘅意思。咁 Camacho 正猶豫之際 ，Quiteria 咧就已經同意咗啦，宣讀咗佢嘅誓詞。呢個神父亦都落淚，現場眾人咧都好動容。正當神父宣佈佢哋嘅共諧連理之後咧，Basilio 咧就突然之間就將呢把劍拔出，全部人都話：哇，奇蹟啊，奇蹟啊！Basilio 咧就話：呢個唔係奇蹟，呢個係一個陷阱，呢啲全部都係扮出嚟嘅，我只係想同 Quiteria 砌啫。Quiteria 冇話因為呢個 trick 而感到憤怒或者咩，反而咧佢好似幾欣賞 Basilio。Camacho 當然就勃然大怒，拔劍相向。呢個時候咧，Don Quixote 就出現啦，企喺 Basilio 嗰邊，佢都拎咗佢嘅長矛出嚟，就指住對方就話：呢一件事，如果你哋要向 Basilio 攻擊嘅咧，你要先經過我。佢話咧，即係 Camacho，你咁有錢，你嘅快樂，你以後任何時間都可以買到嘅。但係 Basilio 咧就唔係啦。即係佢咧就係保護 Basilio 嘅，反正其實個道理就唔係好成立嘅。總之佢就企喺 Basilio 呢邊啊，佢企喺窮人呢邊啊。Camacho 經過一輪嘅斡旋，佢咧都無可奈何，於是乎就話：好，我哋嘅盛宴繼續。咁 Basilio 就同 Quiteria 佢自己嘅人咧就翻去佢哋嘅村莊度自己嘅慶祝。咁當 Quixote 咧亦都跟隨住 Basilio 離開啦。當然最唔開心嘅咧就係 Sancho， 因為佢原本咧諗住喺 Camacho 婚宴嗰度咧就大吃大喝，咁但係而家唔得啦，帶住沉重嘅心情就同呢兩位新人離開啦。好，我哋睇下呢字有啲咩字同大家分享。Pageantry，Pageantry，P-A-G-E-A-N-T-R-Y 呢個文中一開始就出現嘅一個名詞 ，elaborate display or ceremony， 一個盛宴啊，盛大嘅慶典啊。Complacence 呢個 complacence 嘅串法係咁嘅 ，C-O-M-P-L-A-I-S-A-N-C-E 係個名詞嚟嘅，佢意思係 deference to the wishes of others，an act of willing compliance， 一個 compliance 嚟嘅，一個順從、殷勤順從咁嘅意思嘅 complacence。invade，I-N-V-E-I-G-H。聽落去好似有啲似 invade 侵襲啊、襲擊啊，呢個係 invade，I-N-V-E-I-G-H 個意思都係幾 aggressive 嘅，有 aggression 喺度嘅 verb 嚟嘅動詞 speak or write about something with great hostility 猛烈抨擊 invade。好，我哋呢節讀到呢度，下一節再同大家讀嚟聽，拜拜。大家好，讀你聽2.0，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 讀到 Part 2嘅 Chapter 22第22節。呢一節嘅名叫做 Wherein is related the grand adventure of the cave of Montesinos in the heart of La Mancha, which the valiant Don Quixote brought to a happy termination。咁上一回咧就講到 Basilio 就嚟搶婚啊 ，Don Quixote 對於個結果非常之滿意，對於 Basilio 設下呢個陷阱，令到 Quiteria、Camacho 甚至乎神父啦都上當啦，跟隨住 Basilio 咧浩蕩咁樣離開呢個婚禮，點都唔可以仲喺人哋嗰度白吃白喝噶嘛。Sancho 咧亦都不情願喺度跟住 Don Quixote 離開。好，我哋睇下呢一對新人仲有啲咩趣事發生。
Many and great were the attentions shown to Don Quixote by the newly married couple, who felt themselves under an obligation to him for coming forward in defense of their cause, and they exalted his wisdom to the same level with his courage, rating him as a Cid in arms and a Cicero in eloquence. Worthy Sancho enjoyed himself for 3 days at the expense of the pair, from whom they learned that the sham wound was not a scheme arranged with the fair Quiteria, but a device of Basilio's, who counted on exactly the result they had seen. He confessed, it is true, that he had confided his idea to some of his friends, so that at a proper time they might aid him in his purpose and ensure the success of the deception. That, said Don Quixote, is not and ought not to be called deception which aims at virtuous ends. In the marriage of lovers he maintained to be a most excellent end, reminding them, however, that love has no greater enemy than hunger and constant want, For love is all gaiety, enjoyment, and happiness, especially when the lover is in the possession of the object of his love, and poverty and want are the declared enemies of all these, which he said to urge Signor Basilio to abandon the practice of those accomplishments he was skilled in, for though they brought him fame, they brought him no money, and apply himself to the acquisition of wealth by legitimate industry, which will never fail those who are prudent and persevering. The poor man who is a man of honor has a jewel when he has a fair wife, and if she is taken from him, his honor is taken from him and slain. The fair woman who is a woman of honor, and whose husband is poor, deserves to be crowned with the laurels and crowns of victory and triumph. Beauty by itself attracts the desires of all who behold it, and the royal eagles and birds of towering flight stoop on it as on a dainty lure. But if beauty be accompanied by want and penury, then the ravens and the kites and other birds of prey assail it, and she who stands firm against such attacks well deserves to be called the crown of her husband. Remember, O prudent Basilio, added Don Quixote, it was the opinion of a certain sage, I know not whom, that there was not more than one good woman in the whole world, and his advice was that each one should think and believe that this one good woman was his own wife, and in this way he would live happy. I myself am not married, nor, so far, has it ever entered my thoughts to be so. Nevertheless, I would venture to give advice to anyone who might ask it, as to the mode in which he should seek a wife such as he would be content to marry. The first thing I would recommend him would be to look to good name rather than to wealth. For a good woman does not win a good name merely by being good, but by letting it be seen that she is so. An open looseness and freedom do much more damage to a woman's honor than secret depravity. If you take a good woman into your house, it will be an easy matter to keep her good, and even to make her still better. But if you take a bad one, you will find it hard work to mend her, for it is no very easy matter to pass from one extreme to another. I do not say it is impossible, but I look upon it as difficult. Sancho, listening to all this, said to himself, This master of mine, when I say anything that has weight and substance, says I might take a pulpit in hand, and go about the world preaching fine sermons. But I say of him that, when he begins stringing maxims together and giving advice, not only might he take a pulpit in hand, but two on each finger, and go into the marketplaces to his heart's content. Devil take you for a knight's errand. What a lot of things you know. I used to think in my heart that the only thing he knew was what belonged to his chivalry, but there is nothing he won't have a finger in. Sancho muttered this somewhat aloud, and his master overheard him, and asked, What art thou muttering there, Sancho? I am not saying anything or muttering anything, said Sancho. I was only saying to myself that I wish I had heard what your worship has said just now before I married. Perhaps I'd say now, the ox that's loose licks himself well. Is thy Teresa so bad then, Sancho? She is not very bad, replied Sancho, but she is not very good. At least she is not as good as I could wish. Thou dost wrong, Sancho, said Don Quixote, to speak ill of thy wife, for after all she is the mother of thy children. We are quits, returned Sancho, for she speaks ill of me whenever she takes it into her head, especially when she is jealous, and Satan himself could not put up with her then. In fine, they remained 3 days with the newly married couple, by whom they were entertained and treated like kings. Don Quixote begged the fencing licentiate to find him a guide to show him the way to the cave of Montesinos, as he had a great desire to enter it and see with his own eyes if the wonderful tales that were told of it all over the country were true. The licentiate said he would get him a cousin of his own, a famous scholar, and one very much given to reading books of chivalry, who would have great pleasure in conducting him to the mouth of the very cave, and would show him the lakes of Quiteria, which were likewise famous all over La Mancha, and even all over Spain. And he assured him he would find him entertaining, for he was a youth who could write books good enough to be printed and dedicated to princes. The cousin arrived at last, leading an ass in foal, with a pack saddle covered with a party-coloured carpet or sackcloth. Sancho saddled Rocinante, got Dapple ready, and stocked his alforjas, along with which went those of the cousin, likewise well filled, and so, commending themselves to God and bidding farewell to all, they set out, taking the road for the famous cave of Montesinos. On the way, Don Quixote asked the cousin of what sort and character his pursuits, avocations, and studies were, to which he replied that he was by profession a humanist, and that his pursuits and studies were making books for the press, all of great utility and no less entertainment to the nation, One was called the Book of Liveries, in which he describes 703 liveries with their colour, mottos, and ciphers, from which gentlemen of the court might pick and choose any they fancied for festivals and revels, without having to go a-begging for them from anyone, or puzzling their brains, as the saying is, to have them appropriate to their objects and purposes. For, said he, I give the jealous, the rejected, the forgotten, the absent, what will suit them, and fit them without fail. I have another book too, which I shall call Metamorphosis, or the Spanish Ovid, one of rare and original invention. For imitating Ovid in burlesque style, I show in it who the Giralda of Seville and the Angel of Magdalena were, what the sewer of Valenzuela at Cordova was, what the bulls of Guisando, the Sierra Morena, the Leganitos and Lavapis fountains at Madrid, not forgetting those of the Pioggia, of the Canoponado, and of the Priora, and all with the allegories, metaphors, and changes, so that they are amusing, interesting, and instructive, all at once. Another book I have which I call the Supplement to Polydor Virgo, which treats of the invention of things, and is a work of great erudition and research, for I establish and elucidate elegantly some things of great importance which Polydor omitted to mention. He forgot to tell us who was the first man in the world that had a cold in his head, and who was the first to try salivation for the French disease. But I give it accurately set forth, and quote more than 25 authors in proof of it, so you may perceive I have laboured to good purpose, and that the book will be of service to the whole world. Sancho, who had been very attentive to the cousin's words, said to him, Tell me, Signor, and God give you luck in printing your books, can you tell me, who was the first man that scratched his head? For to my thinking it must have been our father Adam. And so it must, replied the cousin, for there is no doubt but Adam had a head and hair, and being the first man in the world, he would have scratched himself sometimes. So I think, said Sancho. But now tell me, who was the first tumbler in the world? Really, brother, answered the cousin, I could not at this moment say positively without having investigated it. I will look it up when I go back to where I have my books, and will satisfy you the next time we meet, for this will not be the last time. Look here, Signor, said Sancho, don't give yourself any trouble about it, for I have just this minute hit upon what I asked you. The first tumbler in the world, you must know, was Lucifer, when they cast or pitched him out of heaven, for he came tumbling into the bottomless pit. You are right, friend, said the cousin, and said Don Quixote, Sancho, that question and answer are not thine own. Thou hast heard them from someone else. Hold your peace, Signor, said Sancho. Faith, if I take to answering questions and answering, I will go on from this till tomorrow morning. Nay, to ask foolish things and answer nonsense, I needn't go looking for help from my neighbours. Thou hast said more than thou art aware of, Sancho, said Don Quixote. For there are some who weary themselves out in learning, proving things that, after they are known and proved, are not worth a farthing to the understanding and memory. In this another pleasant conversation they went by, and that night they put up at a small hamlet, whence it was not more than 2 leagues to the cave of Montesinos. So the cousin told Don Quixote, adding that if he was bent upon entering it, it would be requisite for him to provide himself with ropes, so that he might be tied and lowered into its depths. Don Quixote said that even if it reached to the bottomless pit, he meant to see where it went to. So they bought about 100 fathoms of rope, and next day at 2 in the afternoon they arrived at the cave, the mouth of which is spacious and wide, but full of thorn and wild thick bushes and brambles and briars, so thick and matted that they completely closed it up and covered it over. On coming within sight of it, the cousin, Sancho, and Don Quixote dismounted, and the first 2 immediately tied the latter very firmly with the ropes, and as they were girding and swathing him, Sancho said to him, Mind what you are about, master mine. Don't go burying yourself alive, or putting yourself where you'll be like a bottle put to cool in the well. It's no affair of business of your worships to become the explorer of this, which must be worse than a Moorish dungeon. Tie me and hold thy peace, said Don Quixote, for an emprise like this, friend Sancho, was reserved for me. And said the guide, I beg of you, Signor Don Quixote, to observe carefully and examine with 100 eyes everything that is within there. Perhaps there may be some things for me to put into my book of transformations. The drum is in hands that will know how to beat it well enough, said Sancho Panza. When he had said this and finished the tying, Don Quixote observed, It was careless of us not to have provided ourselves with a small kettlebell to be tied on the rope close to me, the sound of which would show that I was still descending and alive. But as that is out of the question now, in God's hand be it to guide me. And forthwith he fell on his knees and in a low voice offered up a prayer to heaven, imploring God to aid him and grant him success in this to all appearance perilous and untried adventure, and then exclaimed aloud, O mistress of my actions and movements, illustrious and peerless Dulcinea El Toboso, if so be the prayers and supplications of this fortunate lover can reach thy ears, by thy incomparable beauty I entreat thee to listen to them, for they but ask thee not to refuse me thy favour and protection now that I stand in such need of them. I am about to precipitate, to sink, to plunge myself into the abyss that is here before me, only to let the world know that while thou dost favour me, there is no impossibility I will not attempt and accomplish. With these words he approached the cavern and perceived that it was impossible to let himself down or effect an entrance except by sheer force or cleaving a passage. So drawing his sword, he began to demolish and cut away the brambles in the mouth of the cave, at the noise of which vast multitude of crows and choughs flew out of it, so thick and so fast that they knocked Don Quixote down. And if he had been as much of a believer in augury as he was a Catholic Christian, he would have taken it as a bad omen and declined to bury himself in such a place. He got up, however, and as there came no more crows or night birds like the bats that flew out at the same time with the crows, the cousin and Sancho giving him rope, he lowered himself into the depths of the dread cavern, and as he entered it, Sancho sent his blessing after him, making 1,000 crosses over him and saying, God and the Bena de Francia, and the Trinity of Gaeta, guide thee, flower and cream of knights errant. There thou goest, thou daredevil of the earth, heart of steel, arm of brass, once more, God guide thee and send thee back safe, sound and unhurt to the light of this world thou art leaving to bury thyself in the darkness thou art seeking there. And the cousin offered up almost the same prayers and supplications. Don Quixote kept calling to them to give him rope and more rope, and they gave it out little by little, and by the time the calls, which came out of the caves as out of a pipe, ceased to be heard, they had let down the 100 fathoms of rope. They were inclined to pull Don Quixote up again, as they could give him no more rope. However, they waited about half an hour, at the end of which time they began to gather in the rope again with great ease and without feeling any weight, which made them fancy Don Quixote was remaining below. And persuaded that it was so, Sancho wept bitterly, and hauled away in great haste in order to settle the question. When, however, they had come to, as it seemed, rather more than 80 fathoms, they felt a weight, at which they were greatly delighted. And at last, at 10 fathoms more, they saw Don Quixote distinctly, and Sancho called out to him, saying, Welcome back, Señor, for we had begun to think you were going to stop there to found a family. But Don Quixote answered not a word, and drawing him out entirely, they perceived he had his eyes shut and every appearance of being fast asleep. They stretched him on the ground and untied him, but still he did not awake. However, they rolled him back and forwards and shook and pulled him about, so that after some time he came to himself, stretching himself just as if he were waking up from a deep and sound sleep, and looking about him, he said, God forgive you, friends. Ye have taken me away from the sweetest and most delightful existence and spectacle that ever human being enjoyed or beheld. Now indeed do I know that all the pleasures of this life pass away like a shadow and a dream, or fade like flower of the field. O ill-fated Montesinos! O sore-wounded Durandate! O unhappy Belema! O tearful Guadiana! And ye, O hapless daughters of Ridera, who show in your waves and tears that float from your beauteous eyes. The cousin and Sancho Panza listened with deep attention to the words of Don Quixote, who uttered them as though with immense pain he drew them up from his very bowels. They begged of him to explain himself and tell them what he had seen in the hell down there. Hell do you call it? Said Don Quixote. Call it by no such name, for it does not deserve it, as ye shall soon see. He then begged them to give him something to eat, as he was very hungry. They spread the cousin's sackcloth on the grass, and put the stores of the alforjas into requisition, and all three sitting down lovingly and sociably, they made a luncheon and a supper of it all in one. And when the sackcloth was removed, Don Quixote of La Mancha said, Let no one rise and attend to me, my sons, both of you.
好，呢一節就讀完啦。Don Quixote 同呢一對生涯後續發展其實就唔多嘅，都係啲思辨上嘅嘢啦。即係佢認為 Basilio 所作所為就並唔係唔光彩嘅，調翻轉佢覺得佢咁樣做嘅係一個勇敢嘅行為，值得讚賞。咁佢就覺得佢既然贏得妻子，佢就應該對佢嘅太太更加有誠懇啦，同埋忠誠。 叫做留低一個好正面嘅句號。咁與此同時咧，就出現咗附近 Cave of Montesinos 附近一個山窿嘅一個導遊啦。咁佢咧自己都有寫書嘅，佢咧就負責帶嘅Don Quixote去山洞嗰度探險。Don Quixote最中意探險啦，走去呢個山洞途中咧又講咗少少關於呢個導遊少少事啦，關於佢寫作啊諸如此類啦。然之後到個山洞之後咧，佢哋好快就將阿Don Quixote放咗落去，綁喺條繩度放落去，放咗幾低咧，放咗佢去200碼咁低。過咗大概半個鐘，就將佢拉翻起上嚟。但係拉翻起上嚟嘅時候咧，Don Quixote似乎就有啲神志不清嘅，好似瞓緊覺咁樣啦，又唔知係咪暈咗嚟。到後來咧，佢醒翻同 Sancho 同埋呢個導遊講，哇，見到一啲非常之夢幻魔幻嘅嘢啊！但係究竟見到啲咩咧？到呢一刻都未講，佢只係同佢講話：你哋快啲準備啲嘢俾我食，我好肚餓啊！我自己就懷疑咧，佢會唔會係食咗迷幻蘑菇咧？咁啊，睇下下一節會有啲端倪。我哋睇下呢節有啲咩字同大家分享。Burlesque， 名詞嚟嘅。An absurd or comically exaggerated imitation of something, especially a literary or dramatic work of parody, or a variety show typically including striptease. 我哋中文會話係一個滑稽嘅諷刺作品。另一個解釋咧就係豔舞啊，咁有陣時會去到一啲比較法式啲嘅走廊嗰度咧，有 burlesque show 有豔舞。Elucidate, E-L-U-C-I-D-A-T-E， 動詞嚟嘅。Make something clear, explain， 解釋。我哋學術啲嘅講會係探明 elucidate。Chough, C-H-O-U-G-H， 名詞嚟嘅，佢係一種類似烏鴉，同一個烏鴉同一個 family 嘅一種雀啦。不過外形都幾似烏鴉，通常都喺啲山度啊，或者啲懸崖峭壁嗰度出現啦。文中就會提到咧係 crow and chough 喺個山度飛出嚟咁樣。好，呢節讀到呢度，下一次仲得讀你聽，拜拜。大家好，讀你聽2.0，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 讀到 Part 2嘅第23節，呢一節嘅名叫做 Of the wonderful things the incomparable Don Quixote said he saw in the profound cave of Montesinos, the impossibility and magnitude of which caused this adventure to be deemed apocryphal。咁上一回咧就講 Don Quixote 進入咗洞穴 Montesinos， 跟住佢嘅導遊同埋 Sancho 3人嘅啫。Don Quixote 自己一個被綁住身軀咧，就掉咗落去洞穴入面，大概700碼，大概半個鐘頭。當佢被拉翻上嚟嘅時候咧，佢已經係神志不清噶啦，好似瞓着咗咁。到佢醒翻嗰陣時候咧，佢就話咧，佢見到一啲非常之夢幻、超現實嘅嘢。但係咧就點樣咧都講唔清楚，咁呢一節咧就睇下佢點樣講清楚啦。
It was about 4 in the afternoon when the sun, veiled in clouds, with subdued light and tempered beams, enabled Don Quixote to relate, without heat or inconvenience, what he had seen in the cave of Montesinos to his 2 illustrious hearers, and he began as follows.A matter of some 12 or 14 times a man's height down in this pit. On the right-hand side, there is a recess or space, roomy enough to contain a large cart with its mules. A little light reaches it through some chinks or crevices, communicating with it and open to the surface of the earth. This recess or space I perceived when I was already growing weary and disgusted at finding myself hanging suspended by the rope.Traveling downwards into that dark region without any certainty or knowledge of where I was going. So I resolved to enter it and rest myself for a while. I called out, telling you not to let out more rope until I bade you, but you cannot have heard me. I then gathered in the rope you were sending me, and making a coil or pile of it, I seated myself upon it, ruminating and considering what I was to do to lower myself to the bottom, having no one to hold me up.And as I was thus deep in thought and perplexity, suddenly and without provocation, a profound sleep fell upon me. And when I least expected it, I know not how, I awoke and found myself in the midst of the most beautiful, delightful meadow that nature could produce or the most lively human imagination conceive. I opened my eyes, I rubbed them, and found I was not asleep but thoroughly awake. Nevertheless, I felt my head and breast to satisfy myself whether it was I myself who was there or some empty delusive phantom, but touch, feeling, the collected thoughts that passed through my mind, all convinced me that I was the same then and there that I am this moment. Next there presented itself to my sight a stately royal palace or castle, with walls that seemed built of clear transparent crystal, and through two great doors that opened wide therein, I saw coming forth and advancing towards me a venerable old man, clad in a long gown of mulberry-coloured sedge that trailed upon the ground. On his shoulders and breast he had a green satin collegiate hood, and covering his head a black Milanese bonnet, and his snow-white beard fell below his girdle. He carried no arms whatever, nothing but a rosary of beads bigger than fair-sized filberts, each 10th bead being like a moderate ostrich egg. His bearing, his gait, his dignity and imposing presence held me spellbound and wondering. He approached me, and the first thing he did was to embrace me closely, and then he said to me, "For a long time now, O valiant knight Don Quixote of La Mancha, we who are here enchanted in these solitudes have been hoping to see thee, that thou mayest make known to the world what is shut up and concealed in this deep cave, called the Cave of Montesinos, which thou hast entered, an achievement reserved for thy invincible heart and stupendous courage alone to attempt. Come with me, illustrious sir, and I will show thee the marvels hidden within this transparent castle, whereof I am the alcayde and perpetual warden, for I am Montesinos himself, from whom the cave takes its name." The instant he told me he was Montesinos, I asked him if the story he told in the world about here was true, that he had taken out the heart of his great friend Durandarte from his breast with a little dagger and carried it to the Lady Belema, as his friend, when at the point of death, had commanded him. He said in reply that they spoke the truth in every respect except as to the dagger, for it was not a dagger, nor little, but a burnished poniard, sharper than an awl. "That poniard must have been made by Ramon de Hoces, the Sevillian," said Sancho. "I do not know," said Don Quixote. "It could not have been by that poniard maker, however, because Ramon de Hoces was a man of yesterday, and the affair of Roncesvalles, where this mishap occurred, was long ago. But the question is of no great importance, nor does it affect or make any alteration in the truth or substance of the story." "That is true," said the cousin. "Continue, Señor Don Quixote, for I am listening to you with the greatest pleasure in the world." "And with no less do I tell the tale," said Don Quixote. "And so, to proceed, the venerable Montesinos led me into the palace of crystal, where, in a low chamber, strangely cool and entirely of alabaster, was an elaborately wrought marble tomb, upon which I beheld, stretched at full length, a knight, not of bronze, or marble, or jasper, as are seen on other tombs, but of actual flesh and bone. His right hand lay on the side of his heart, but before I could put any question to Montesinos, he, seeing me gazing at the tomb in amazement, said to me, 'This is my friend Durandarte, flower and mirror of the true lovers and valiant knights of his time. He is held enchanted here, as I myself and many others are, by that French enchanter Merlin, who, they say, was the devil's son. But my belief is, not that he was the devil's son, but that he knew, as the saying is, a point more than the devil. How and why he enchanted us, no one knows, but time will tell, and I suspect that time is not far off. What I marvel at is that I know it to be as sure as that it is now day, that Durandarte ended his life in my arms, and that after his death I took out his heart with my own hands. And indeed it must have weighed more than 2 pounds, for, according to naturalists, he who has a large heart is more largely endowed with valor than he who has a small one. Then, as this is the case, and as the knight did really die, how comes it that he now moans and sighs from time to time, as if he were still alive?" As he said this, the wretched Durandarte cried out in a loud voice, "O cousin Montesinos, 'twas my last request of thee, when my soul hath left the body, and that lying dead I be, with thy poniard or thy dagger, cut the heart from out my breast, and bury it to Belema. This was my last request." On hearing which, the venerable Montesinos fell on his knees before the unhappy knight, and with tearful eyes exclaimed, "Long since, Signor Durandarte, my beloved cousin, long since have I done what you bade me on that sad day when I lost you. I took out your heart as well as I could, not leaving an atom of it in your breast. I wiped it with a lace handkerchief, and I took the road to France with it. Having first laid you in the bosom of the earth with tears enough to wash and cleanse my hands of the blood that covered them after wandering among your bowels, and more by token, O cousin of my soul, at the first village I came to after leaving Roncesvalles, I sprinkle a little salt upon your heart to keep it sweet, and bring it, if not fresh, at least pickled, into the presence of the Lady Belema, whom, together with you, myself, Guadiana, your squire, the Duenna Ruidera, and her 7 daughters and 2 nieces, and many more of your friends and acquaintances, the sage Merlin has been keeping enchanted here these many years. And although more than 500 have gone by, not one of us has died. Ruidera and her daughters and nieces alone are missing, and these, because of the tears they shed, Merlin, out of the compassion he seems to have felt for them, changed into so many lakes, which to this day in the world of the living and in the province of La Mancha are called the lakes of Ruidera. The 7 daughters belong to the kings of Spain, and the 2 nieces of the knights of a very holy order called the Order of St. John. Guadiana, your squire, likewise bewailing your fate, was changed into a river of his own name. But when he came to the service and beheld the son of another heaven, so great was his grief at finding he was leaving you, that he plunged into the bowels of the earth. However, as he cannot help following his natural course, he from time to time comes forth and shows himself to the sun and the world. The lakes aforesaid send him their waters, and with these the others that come to him, he makes a grand and imposing entrance into Portugal. But for all that, go where he may, he shows his melancholy and sadness, and takes no pride in breeding dainty choice fish, only coarse and tasteless sorts, very different from those of the golden Tagus. All this that I tell you now, O cousin mine, I have told you many times before, and as you make no answer, I fear that either you believe me not, or do not hear me, whereat I feel God knows what grief. I have now news to give you, which, if it serves not to alleviate your sufferings, will not in any wise increase them. Know that you have here before you that great knight of whom the sage Merlin has prophesied such great things, that Don Quixote of La Mancha, I mean, who has again, and a better purpose than in past times, revived in these days knight-errantry, long since forgotten, and by whose intervention and aid it may be we shall be disenchanted, for great deeds are reserved for great men. And if that may not be, said the wretched Durandata in a low and feeble voice, if that may not be, then, my cousin, I say patience and shovel. And turning over on his side, he relapsed into his former silence without uttering another word. And now there was heard a great outcry and lamentation, accompanied by deep sighs and bitter sobs. I turned round, and through the crystal wall I saw passing through another chamber a procession of 2 lines of fair damsels, all clad in mourning, and with white turbans of Turkish fashion on their heads. Behind, in the rear of these, there came a lady, for so from her dignity she seemed to be, also clad in black, with a white veil so long and ample that it swept the ground. Her turban was twice as large as the largest of any of the others, her eyebrows met, her nose was rather flat, her mouth was large but with ruddy lips, and her teeth, of which at times she allowed a glimpse, were seen to be sparse and ill-set, though as white as peeled almonds. She carried in her hands a fine cloth, and in it, as well as I could make out, a heart that had been mummied, so parched and dried was it. Montesinos told me that all those forming the procession were the attendants of Durandata and Belema, who were enchanted there with their master and mistress, and that the last, she who carried the heart in the cloth, was the Lady Belema, who with her damsels 4 days in the week went in procession singing, or rather weeping, dirges over the body and miserable hearts of his cousin, and that if she appeared to me somewhat ill-favoured or not so beautiful as fame reported her, it was because of the bad nights and worse days that she passed in that enchantment, so I could see by the great dark circles round her eyes, and her sickly complexion, her sallowness, and the rings round her eyes, said he, are not caused by the periodical ailment usual with women, for it is many months and even years since she has had any, but by the grief her own heart suffers because of that which she holds in her hand perpetually, and which recalls and brings back to her memory the sad fate of her lost lover. Were it not for this, hardly would the great Dulcinea El Toboso, so celebrated in all these parts, and even the world, come up to her for beauty, grace, and gaiety. Hold hard, said I at this. Tell your story as you ought, Signor Don Montesinos, for you know very well that all comparisons are odious, and there is no occasion to compare one person with another. The peerless Dulcinea del Toboso is what she is, and the Lady Dona Belema is what she is and has been, and that's enough. To which he made answer, Forgive me, Signor Don Quixote. I own I was wrong and spoke unadvisedly in saying that the Lady Dulcinea could scarcely come up to the Lady Belema, for it were enough for me to have learned, by what means I know not, that you are her knight, to make me bite my tongue out before I compared her to anything save heaven itself. After this apology which the great Montesinos made me, my heart recovered itself from the shock I had received in hearing my lady compared with Belema. Still I wonder, said Sancho, that your worship did not get upon the old fellow and bruise every bone of him with kicks and pluck his beard until you didn't leave a hair in it. Nay, Sancho, my friend, said Don Quixote, it would not have been right in me to do that, for we are all bound to pay respect to the aged, even though they be not knights, but especially to those who are, and who are enchanted. I only know I gave him as good as he brought in the many other questions and answers we exchanged. I cannot understand, Signor Don Quixote, remarked the cousin here, how it is that your worship, in such a short space of time as you have been below there, could have seen so many things, and said and answered so much. How long is it since I went down? Asked Don Quixote. Little better than an hour, replied Sancho. That cannot be, returned Don Quixote, because night overtook me while I was there, and day came, and it was night again, and day again 3 times, so that, by my reckoning, I have been 3 days in those remote regions beyond our ken. My master must be right, replied Sancho, for as everything that has happened to him is by enchantment, maybe what seems to us an hour would seem 3 days and nights there. That's it, said Don Quixote. And did your worship eat anything all that time, Signor? Asked the cousin. I never touched a morsel, answered Don Quixote, nor did I feel hunger or think of it. And do the enchanted eat? Said the cousin. They neither eat, said Don Quixote, nor are they subject to the greater excrements, though it is thought that their nails, beards, and hair grow. And do the enchanted sleep now, Signor? Asked Sancho. Certainly not, replied Don Quixote. At least, during those 3 days I was with them, not one of them closed an eye, nor did I either. The proverb, tell me what company thou keepest, and I'll tell thee what thou art, is to the point here, said Sancho. Your worship keeps company with enchanted people that are always fasting and watching. What wonder is it, then, that you neither eat nor sleep while you're with them? But forgive me, Signor, if I say that all this you have told us now, may God take me, I was just going to say the devil, if I believe a single particle. What? Said the cousin. Has Signor Don Quixote then been lying? Why, even if he wished it, he has not had time to imagine and put together such a host of lies. I don't believe my master lies, said Sancho. If not, what dost thou believe? Asked Don Quixote. I believe, replied Sancho, that this Merlin, or those enchanters who enchanted the whole crew your worship says you saw in discourse with down there, stuff your imagination or your mind with all this rigmarole you have been treating us to, and all that is still to come. All that might be, Sancho, replied Don Quixote, but it is not so, for everything that I have told you I saw with my own eyes, and touched with my own hands. But what will you say when I tell you now how, among the countless other marvelous things Montesino showed me, he showed me 3 country girls who went skipping and capering like goats over the pleasant fields there, and the instant I beheld them, I knew one to be the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso, and the other 2, those same country girls that were with her and that we spoke to on the road from El Toboso. I asked Montesinos if he knew them, and he told me he did not, but he thought they must be some enchanted ladies of distinction, for it was only a few days before that they had made their appearance in these meadows. But I was not to be surprised at that, because there were a great many other ladies there of times past and present, enchanted in various strange shapes, and among them he had recognized Queen Guinevere and her dame Quintanona, she who poured out the wine for Lancelot when he came from Britain. When Sancho Panza heard his master say this, he was ready to take leave of his senses, or die with laughter. For, as he knew the real truth about the pretended enchantment of Dulcinea, in which he himself had been the enchanter and concocter of all the evidence, he made up his mind at last that, beyond all doubt, his master was out of his wits and stark mad. So he said to him, It was an evil hour, a worse season, and a sorrowful day, when your worship, dear master mine, went down to the other world in an unlucky moment when you met with Signor Montesinos, who has sent you back to us like this. You were well enough hereabout in your full senses, such as God had given you, delivering maxims and giving advice at every turn, and not as you are now, talking the greatest nonsense that can be imagined. As I know thee, Sancho, said Don Quixote, I heed not thy words. Nor I, your worships, said Sancho, whether you beat me or kill me for those I have spoken, and will speak if you don't correct and mend your own. But tell me, while we are still at peace, how or by what did you recognize the lady our mistress, and if you spoke to her, what did she say, and what did she answer? I recognized her, said Don Quixote, by her wearing the same garment she wore when thou didst point her out to me. I spoke to her, but she did not utter a word in reply. On the contrary, she turned her back on me and took to flight, at such a pace that crossbow bolt could not have overtaken her. I wished to follow her, and would have done so had not Montesinos recommended me not to take the trouble, as it would be useless, particularly as the time was drawing near when it would be necessary for me to quit the cavern. He told me, moreover, that in course of time he would let me know how he and Belema and Durandata and all who were there were to be disenchanted. But of all I saw and observed down there, what gave me most pain was that while Montesinos was speaking to me, one of the two companions of the hapless Dulcinea approached me on one without my having seen her coming, and with tears in her eyes said to me in a low agitated voice, My lady Dulcinea del Toboso kisses your worship's hands, and entreats you to do her the favour of letting her know how you are, and being in great need, she also entreats your worship as earnestly as she can to be so good as to lend her half a dozen reals, or as much as you may have about you, on this new dimity petticoat that I have here, and she promises to repay them very speedily. I was amazed and taken aback by such a message, and turning to Signor Montesinos, I asked him, Is it possible, Signor Montesinos, that persons of distinction under enchantment can be in need? To which he replied, Believe me, Signor Don Quixote, that which is called need is to be met with everywhere, and penetrates all quarters and reaches everyone, and does not spare even the enchanted. And as the lady Dulcinea del Toboso sends to bag those 6 reals, and the pledge is to all appearance a good one, there is nothing for it but to give them to her. For no doubt she must be in some great strait. I will take no pledge of her, I replied, nor yet can I give her what she asks. For all I have is 4 reals, which I gave, and I said, Tell your mistress, my dear, that I am grieved to the heart because of her distresses, and wish I was a Fuca to remedy them, and that I would have her know that I cannot be, and ought not be, in health while deprived of the happiness of seeing her and enjoying her discreet conversation, and that I implore her as earnestly as I can to allow herself to be seen and addressed by this her captive servant and forlorn knight. Tell her, too, that when she least expects it, she will hear it announced that I have made an oath and vow after the fashion of that which the Marquis of Mantua made to avenge his nephew Baldwin, when he found him at the point of death at the heart of the mountains, which was not to eat bread off a tablecloth, and other trifling matters which he added, until he had avenged them. And I will make the same to take no rest, and to roam the 7 regions of earth more thoroughly than the infant Don Pedro of Portugal ever roamed them, until I have disenchanted her. All that and more you owe, my lady, the damsel's answer to me, and taking the 4 reals, instead of making me a curtsy, she cut a caper, springing 2 full yards into the air. Oh, bless the God, exclaimed Sancho aloud at this. Is it possible that such things can be in the world, and that enchanters and enchantments can have such power in it as to have changed my master's right senses into a craze so full of absurdity? Oh, Signor, for God's sake, consider yourself, have a care for your honour, and give no credit to this silly stuff that has left you scant and short of wits. Thou talkest in this way because thou lovest me, Sancho, said Don Quixote, and not being experienced in the things of the world. Everything that has some difficulty about it seems to thee impossible. But time will pass, as I said before, and I will tell thee some of the things I saw down there which will make thee believe what I have related now, the truth of which admits of neither reply nor question.
好，呢一節讀到嚟呢一度。Don Quixote 對住 Sancho 同埋佢嘅導遊就和盤托出喺個洞穴入面所見所聞，見到啲咩咧？哇，水晶城堡喎， 一望無際嘅平原，一出現喺佢眼前，竟然就係 Montesinos 本人。咁佢嘅外表當然都係長鬚啊咁樣啦。呢個老人咧就同佢講，混咗洞穴嘅眾人，包括 Durandarte 同埋佢嘅情人 Dilemma， 同埋佢有個 Squire， 佢都有個侍從。Montesinos 咧就同 Don Quixote講，佢哋點解會混咗喺度咧？佢哋受到來自法國嘅巫師 Merlin 受到好似佢哋嘅施法，於是乎就混咗喺度，不知不覺咧已經係好幾百年都唔出奇啦。混咗喺度咧，亦都唔知道點解，唔知道點解 Merlin 向佢施法令到佢留喺度。Montesinos 曾經係佢好朋友 Durandarte 攞咗佢嘅心臟出嚟，開咗佢嘅胸膛，攞佢嘅心出嚟，就獻咗俾 Lady Dilemma 咁樣。一啲好荒誕嘅事情 Don Quixote 都係照單全收嘅，因為呢啲嘢咧同傳說就好接近。Don Quixote咧亦都同 Montesinos 講咧，佢咧就係遊俠，亦都要奉行呢個遊俠精神。故事嘅尾聲咧 Don Quixote 同 Sancho 講，佢話喺第一面嗰個生活咧轉眼即逝，但係咧都過咗3日3夜。Sancho 咧就話啦，冇可能，我哋放你落去半個鐘頭啫。而Don Quixote呢個時候就講啦，佢唔單止咧就見到 Montesinos， 總見到 Dulcinea El Toboso， 即係佢嘅情人啦，同埋嘅另外嗰幾位村姑。呢幾位女子咧，經 Montesinos 證實係受到魔法嘅影響而變到咁醜陋嘅。Sancho 一聽到呢度咧，佢就知道原來我主人真係黐線嘅，因為 Sancho 深知道明當日佢對 Don Quixote 所形容嘅 Dulcinea 全部都係佢捏造出嚟嘅。真正嘅 Dulcinea咧，佢哋仲未遇到，甚至乎唔存在。但係咧，Don Quixote就一心諗住 Dulcinea 係天仙下凡，係女神級，只不過咧係受到巫師嘅魔法所影響嘅啫。Don Quixote最後亦都有提到 Dulcinea 嘅同行村姑咧，有問佢攞錢，問佢攞錢嚟做咩咧，都唔重要嘅，問佢攞幾蚊咁啦。Don Quixote都冇，係咪佢攞6蚊？佢話冇，我知得4蚊啫，咁都俾晒佢。Sancho 就真係哭笑不得啊，覺得佢嘅主人咧係神志不清。呢一節嘅字唔多啊，分享2個啦。第一個字 collegiate， C-O-L-L-E-G-I-A-T-E 嗱，形容詞嚟嘅 ，belonging or relating to a college or its students， 即係同學校有關嘅。文中用 collegiate 去形容醫文嘅。第二個字 poignant，P-O-N-I-A-R-D， 古字咧而家唔會用噶啦，係形容一啲小匕首啊、小刀啊 ，small slim dagger。好，我哋呢節到呢度，下一節再讀你聽，拜拜。